updated more closely in a few minutes. Has this data reduced religious experience to an entirely natural phenomenon? Is what we used to think of as an encounter with the divine now merely a series of brain manipulations? And this is an area that is known as neurotheology, which is probably fairly self-explanatory and brings together the disciplines of neuroscience and theology. So what I'd like to do in this lecture is examine some of the data briefly and then look at two questions that philosophers and scientists have been asking. The first question is, given that the brain is active during religious experience, are there specific regions dedicated to religious experience? And are these more active in religious people than the irreligious? Do some just have the right brain wiring, whereas others don't? And then secondly, I'd like to look at the question, do these discoveries mean that neuroscience has explained away religious experience and belief in God as merely brain activity? Of course, it's worth saying, what do we mean by religious experience? That's a very, very broad term. Different people mean different things by it. Perhaps one of the most famous psychologists to look at religious experience was William James, and he defines religious experience as the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men, and I presume women, in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. And then the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, a religious experience is defined as any experience carrying as its content the presence of something divine or transcendent. Now, of course, even in those definitions, we're still talking very broadly, but what we will look at is some very specific types of religious engagement. So let's turn to those now. So Andrew Newberg, who's a well-known person who's done quite a lot of research in this field, the Center for Spirituality and the Mind. He has studied several types of religious practice. Firstly, Tibetan Buddhist meditation, where monks were engaged in the kind of inner mental focus that is involved in Buddhist meditation. And he saw a number of things. He saw increased frontal lobe activity, which was interpreted as a readiness to attend to whatever is happening. When you come into a state of meditation, you're kind of ready and attentive to whatever is happening. He also saw a decreased parietal cortex, which was reflecting becoming less and less aware of the external environment and orienting oneself and focusing less and less on the outside, more and more on the journey to transcendence. So that was interesting that, the brain is active in these interesting ways. And he compared that with what we might call standard Christian prayer, if there is such a thing indeed. And there were Franciscan nuns praying liturgy and reciting Bible verses. And actually they saw the same two things plus something new. They saw, again, this increased frontal lobe activity, similar to the Buddhist monks, where they were ready to attend and were focused on a particular phrase or verse from the Bible. So there is an attentiveness to the thing at hand. And also saw the decreased parietal cortex, meaning they became less and less aware of their external environment as they focused on the words. But they also saw the inferior parietal lobe activated, and this is one of the areas known to be associated with language and abstract ideas. So there was something distinctive about the fact that they were engaged in verbal prayer, whereas Buddhist meditation may or may not be verbal. In fact, the goal is probably to transcend the verbal into the non-verbal sphere. And so you're seeing similarities, but also differences that distinguish different kinds of prayer. And then later they did a study of praying in tongues, where instead of, you might argue that meditation and standard Christian prayer are both internal, but praying in tongues, a more charismatic expression, is external. And for the baseline in this study, the volunteers were singing gospel music rather than simply doing nothing, resting. And in this study, they saw decreased frontal lobe activity compared with the other two types of prayer, which they took to mean that actually there was something about you are receiving something when you're praying in tongues. There's something that comes to you from outside rather than that's being generated from within. And this is reflected in the patterns of brain activity. Just one final study, a functional MRI study looking at people's brains when they're reciting formalized prayers versus improvised praying, people that are just kind of talking to God relationally versus people that are reciting kind of formal prayers. And they saw greater activation in areas of social cognition in the kind of more informal types of prayer. And they interpreted those as reflecting the more interpersonal interaction in a person that's praying personally. So it's interesting that there are these studies that are telling us that the brain is active, and that the way in which it's active seems to draw distinctions between different kinds of prayer. And that's interesting in and of itself, lots of discussion that we could have. Now, so far we have looked at healthy volunteers, but if we take the conversation a bit further back, and we started with Dostoevsky, there are some that, what do we do with this view that we began with, that certain neurological disorders are associated with religious experience? And there are repeated accounts in the literature, as we've mentioned, of patients with temporal lobe epilepsy, a disorder in which the temporal lobe is overactive, leading to seizures, who describe this aura in religious terms. And one of the first people to really look at this was the Canadian neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield, who worked extensively with temporal lobe epilepsy patients in the 50s and 60s. And he developed a treatment method known as the Montreal procedure, which was essentially a method that looked at surgical stimulation of the temporal lobe to try and identify the damaged tissue so that it can be destroyed and stop the seizures. So he actually exposed the cortex of an awake patient, and that is, once you've gone through the scalp, the cortex has no pain receptors, so it's not painful to the patients. They can remain awake, and he would stimulate different areas of the cortex, and the patient would tell him what they're feeling or sensing or seeing at that point, and that's how so much of the surface of the cortex has been able to be mapped through the work of Wilder Penfield. And he discovered that patients sometimes described feeling out of their body during stimulation of the temporal lobe. And so this does raise interesting questions. Is the Montreal procedure inducing a kind of religious experience? And if so, does that mean religious experience can be explained by brain activity in the temporal lobe? How do we make sense of this data? And so it causes those two questions to arise that I mentioned earlier. Firstly, is there neural machinery? Are there dedicated regions of the brain that are responsible for religious experience? Are there brain regions and networks that, when activated, generate a religious experience? Is Penfield's temporal lobe a God spot, if you like, or a God module that is active in a religious person, but less so in agnostics and atheists and those of no religion. And so there was a period in the 90s, really, where people really went after this question of the God module or the God spot. Is there a dedicated set of machinery that religious people have that irreligious people do not have? And one person that contributed to this discussion was someone called Valanaya Ramachandran, and he was at the time in San Diego, and again working with epilepsy patients. And he, after his research, drew the conclusion that yes, there was a particular module that underlies religious experience. He said the neural basis of religious experience and dedicated machinery or dedicated neural machinery in the temporal lobes concerned with religion. He basically concluded that this increased activity in the temporal lobes, or indeed abnormal activity, is all that is needed for a person to have a kind of a religious encounter. And he presented that at the Society for Neuroscience in 1997. But shortly after, in the same year, in fact, a number of other scientists disagreed. They actually said they had plenty of people that, yes, they had this aura, but they didn't describe it in religious terms. They tended to use everyday language involving taste, smells, memories, emotions, joys, and so on. And so this aura may have been interpreted religiously by some, but that was more to do with the pre-existing beliefs of that person rather than the activity in their brain necessarily making it a religious experience. And this is what they called the limbic marker hypothesis. And so essentially, overall, the neuroscience does not support a God spot or a God region. In fact, those of you that are kind of keeping up or in the field of neuroscience will know that the language of this region is responsible for this activity. Really, it's moved on from that, and the language is much more about networks that are contributing to any one function in a person. And we've, completed the Human Genome Project, and neuroscientists are now engaged in the Human Connectome Project to discover as many connections in the human brain, neural pathways, as they possibly can, which seems like a slightly daunting undertaking. But then we thought that about the Human Genome Project. So, yes, so the notion that there is a particular region is not supported by the neuroscience. There are networks, but nevertheless, is the extent to which I can experience God still related to the wiring of my brain? Because is it the case that, people sometimes ask, are some people just wired for God? Maybe I just don't have the right kind of brain to be a religious person. And this notion may appeal to some because it takes the decision out of our hands and puts it into our heads. But essentially, the brain imaging data, again, doesn't allow for this. And I find it helpful to use the analogy of a table. I in previous talks have said in my family room at home sits a table, but it's not this table. This is a picture from IKEA, and actually it's very rare for any lounge that I've ever inhabited to look as tidy as this one, and probably it never will. So anyway, just picture a table at home. By name, it is a dining table, but in reality, it serves many functions. Yes, we eat meals around this table with family and friends, but also our children have completed homework at this table and done various craft activities at this table. We have held meetings around this table, and I've written talks and bits of books at this table. The table doesn't have one sole function. It actually serves many different functions depending on the time of day. It can be an office, a meeting room, a space for the creative arts. And actually, this is helpful when we think about the brain regions that are involved, that are recruited in religious engagement, in meditation, in prayer, and so on. They are not unique to religious activity. They are actually brain networks that serve multiple roles across multiple functions in a human being. But they happen to be recruited at times in religious activity as well. And so what does this mean? It means that everybody has all that they need. It means that every person has all of the brain machinery that they need to experience God. It's not that some are more wired for God than other people. We actually all have the structures we need, and that actually our capacity to engage in religious belief and practice doesn't come from forces beyond our control that we either have or don't. It's actually much more complex than that. And I have a quote up there from Warren Brown: religious, mental, and experiential phenomena do not engage a single brain area, nor are they unique sorts of brain events, but they involve patterns of brain activation found also in other forms of human cognition and subjective experience. In fact, rather than some people being kind of more religious than others, it seems that all of us, in a sense, are incurably religious. The whole development of the discipline of cognitive science of religion rests on the observation that human beings seem to have a natural bias towards religious belief, that wherever you go in the world there are religious practices. And this seems to be common to all people, even if it's expressed in different ways in different cultures. And in some sense, we're all wired for God, not just some people with a particular type of brain. Justin Barrett, who's a key proponent of this and also a Christian, he would say that cognitive science of religion provides evidence that humans do have a natural propensity toward believing in some kind of God, and perhaps particularly a super powerful, immortal creator. So moving on to question 2, and perhaps this is the more important question, has this neurological data explained away religious experience as merely brain activity? I want to take a few minutes to explain where this comes from and why the answer is no. And the answer to "am I just my brain?" is also no. If you can write a book with a title where the answer is no, maybe that's not a bad thing. Anyway, I don't know what I'm saying. This perspective is influenced by a particular approach that comes from some neuroscientists and some philosophers that essentially says you are your brain. Everything that you do, say, and think is driven by neurons in your head. And there are some brilliant scientists that believe this. One such person being Francis Crick, famous for co-discovering the DNA double helix with James Watson, but who also later went on to say, you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. And so this is a view that is voiced by some. It's not voiced by all, but it is a vocal position that seems to keep coming up. But of course, in response, we begin to say that many would agree it's not enough to simply talk about the brain. We also need to talk about the mind, that there are actually two different things at play. There is the brain with its cells and electrical activity and synapses and chemicals. And then there is the mind with its thoughts and feelings and emotions and memories. In addition to a brain, each of us has an inner reality, or as the philosopher Thomas Nagel would have said, there's something that it is like to be you, that measuring data from your brain doesn't capture. We are conscious beings, and this is the million-dollar question that is not a new question. Sometimes we can be under the impression that theologians are suddenly scrabbling around with this kind of explosion of understanding in neuroscience. Now that we know we have this amazing brain, we no longer, we've solved the problem. It's all due to the physical processes in the brain. But of course, this has been debated since the ancient world. It was the body-soul conversation at that point. But it is not a new question. It's known as the mind-brain problem today. How do you get from reactions in your head to what it's like to be you? And Susan Greenfield, Baroness Susan Greenfield, a physiology professor at the University of Oxford, not a Christian, put it, and listen to her language. How does the water of boring old brain cells and sludgy stuff translate into the wine of phenomenological subjective experience? And of course, the perspective driving the attempt to explain away everything in brain activity is saying that the mind is the brain. The reductive physicalist approach that says that mental processes are brain processes. The mind is reducible to physical processes in the brain. But there are many, including many agnostics and atheists, and people of different beliefs who believe that brain processes and conscious experience are two very different things. So much so that people like David Chalmers of NYU have named this the hard problem of consciousness. He would distinguish between easy problems and hard problems. Easy problems are looking at how you get from one state of consciousness to another. The hard problem is how on earth are we conscious at all, if all you have to work with is a physical brain. Just to kind of illustrate this a tiny bit more before we come back to religious experience. We've had tea and coffee as we've come in. If we live in a purely material universe and all you have to work with is physical descriptions, describe to me the smell of coffee. You might offer me the chemical structure of caffeine, but that doesn't get you any closer to the smell of coffee. You might describe to me the physiology as you drink it and digest it, all the enzymes that are activated, all the chemical reactions going on in the cell. But that doesn't get you any closer to the smell of coffee. If you want to understand the smell of coffee, you need to smell it. There's no other way. There is no physical description that gets you there. And this is an example of a quail, or in its plural, qualia. And qualia are qualitative experiences that are impossible to describe physically. And of course, the ultimate qualia is the experience of what it is to be you. Measuring data from your brain just isn't going to give us that, even though it will give us really interesting data from your brain. So, and we're in this conversation all the time. The science has shown us that mind and brain are connected. Clearly they are connected, they are correlated. But just because they are connected does not mean they are identical. It does not mean they are synonymous. It doesn't mean that one thing overrules and rules out the other. And so on this basis, we come back to the question, does brain activity undermine the religious experience itself? Not at all. The hard problem that David Chalmers coined reminds us that the brain activity is one thing, but it's not the experience. We only need to think about something like, when you're in love. There are all kinds of imaging studies that have been conducted to look at what's happening in the brain during the process of romantic love. And of course, they have told us that a series of reward centers or pleasure centers are activated when someone is in love. Great. But does this mean that the experience of being in love is not genuine? Now that you know what's happening in the brain, does that mean the experience of being in love isn't genuine? And when we start to talk about that, you say, well, of course not. These two things are correlated, but they are quite distinct as well. And it is the same with religious experience. That the fact that there is activity in the brain does not call into question the authenticity of the experience itself. The experience is still valid and real. And to determine if it's authentic, we ought not to be looking at brain activity, but actually asking other questions. What kind of encounter is it? Is it consistent with the beliefs of the person? Are there other kinds? Does it fit within a bigger framework? And so on. Does the presence of brain activity call into question God? Well, no, in the same way that the presence of brain activity when you're in love doesn't call into question the existence of your boyfriend, girlfriend, or spouse. Similarly, the existence of patterns of activity in the brain doesn't call into question the existence of God. The existence of God is the reason that there is activity in the brain in the first place. And again, correlation does not necessarily equal causation. Just because something is mediated by the brain, just because something is experienced through the brain, doesn't necessarily mean that it began and ended in the brain. I could talk about, I'm going to skip over this. We've already covered the point that we kind of flip-flop quite a lot between what science can tell us and philosophical perspectives. We can come back to this if you want to in the question time. But we often confuse what science can tell us about something with a philosophical position that we impose upon the science to draw conclusions. And this is happening all the time. Now, of course, theologically, we can say, and we know, that human beings are integrated physical and spiritual beings. Genesis 2 tells us that the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Human beings are both dust of the ground and the breath of life, which the Hebrew is neshama or ruach, which is spirit. And they became a living nephesh, which is the word for soul, which actually a very integrated, holistic notion of soul, very different to the Greek notion that Plato espoused. And therefore, we are integrated physical and spiritual beings, and therefore activity in the brain is exactly what we should expect. We shouldn't be threatened or surprised by this. In fact, it's exactly what we ought to expect. And we ought to be more concerned if there was nothing going on in our brains when we were engaged in prayer or relating to God. A helpful quote from N.T. Wright about this as well that I can make available to you. I can make the presentation available to you if that's helpful. And of course, there are limits to what neuroscience will be able to tell us about religion in the end, because religious belief is far more complicated than simply the brain. The brain will be able to tell us so much, but we need to go much further beyond that in order to fully understand. Malcolm Jeeves makes the case that it's more like a baseball religion is more like baseball, which is a kind of complex social phenomenon than a kind of being reduced to neuroscientific data on its own. That's the essential take-home point. And I guess ultimately, if we want to really bring this back, we are also mindful that the Christian faith rests not on experience per se, but on history. We're not primarily invited into some mountaintop detached encounter, but to something much more ordinary and extraordinary than this. The Christian faith doesn't stand or fall on religious experiences, important though they are, and they are important, but ultimately it anchors around history, a historical event, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I guess the invitation is not primarily into an experience, though it is into a reality that is real, but it anchors around history rather than experience as the primary focus. And of course, God is experienced in the Christian life in very ordinary ways, as well as the kind of mountaintop experience, although perhaps, many would say those are rarer for a Christian. The Christian life is about God getting involved in the very ordinary and making it extraordinary. So I think that I'm gonna finish there, and I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sharon. And we do have time for a few questions here and online, if anyone has any questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Scripture talks about being transformed by the renewing of your mind as a Christian. So do our brains change when we can become Christians? Is it a transformation that's ongoing? Or?
That is a great question. So clearly, and what the neuroscience is now telling us is that your brain is incredibly plastic, and it's incredibly plastic for the majority of your life. And not that long ago, we believed the brain was very fixed and static. But actually, we know now that practice does make perfect, and you can rewire your brain through use. And it is a fascinating thought, isn't it, to think what it means to be born again, and what the Holy Spirit, which is a layer that sits on top of everything that we've talked about, actually does to the mind. And I think that, yes, I think there's every reason to believe that as we kind of submit our minds to Christ and allow God to help our thought patterns, that actually there is rewiring that takes place that's in parallel with whatever's happening spiritually and mentally. That if we are body, mind, and arguably spirit, then those three things are working together. And of course, in a way, it's the theological complement to cognitive behavioral therapy, that it's kind of training our thought life and thought patterns with an impact on our behavior as a result. Yeah, thank you for the question.
From online, has our neurological understanding of qualia advanced significantly beyond what T.S. Eliot wrote in The Dry Salvages as follows? We had the experience but missed the meaning. An approach to the meaning restores the experience in a different form beyond any meaning we can assign to happiness. I have said before that the past experience revived in the meaning is not the experience of one life only, but of many generations, not forgetting something that is probably quite ineffable.
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you for the quote. I'm not familiar with that particular quote from T.S. Eliot, but I think that ultimately qualia, that the conversation around qualia hasn't changed for centuries and hasn't been resolved. And of course, you even have the scenario of the neuroscientist Christoph Koch and the philosopher David Chalmers striking a deal 30 years ago that if they kind of crack the hard problem of consciousness and can really get to the heart of experience and this unique kind of what it is like to be you, then one of them would pay the other quite a lot of money. And I think somebody owes somebody some money, because we're just no further forward. There is still something irreducible about the fact that there is a qualitative aspect to life that cannot be captured physically. It correlates with physicality, but the physicality isn't the experience, and I don't think we will get away from that. It's another embarrassing barrier that we keep coming up against, that in order to solve it, I'm not sure neuroscience alone can get us there. Thank you for the question.
Thanks very much for your presentation. A bit of a practical question for you. I'm finding particularly the younger generation are more than happy to say, love is just an experience in the brain, religious experience just an experience in your brain, everything is, and that it's brave to just sort of take that plunge into the dark and say that everything can just be explained in materialistic ways. What's your best answer to dealing with kind of the generation that is particularly attached to that idea?
Yeah. Oh, great question. I think that, firstly, I want to say that generation seems to really care about experience, actually. And in terms of how they approach Christianity, they want to know if it is authentic and experiential. And then they'll come to the reason and argumentation. And that impacts the way that we try and argue and help them with this question. How do you explain quality with just physicality? But if we go with just the physical, that everything is just your brain, then you end up in some really tricky ground, because you could say, well, how about the scenario that your boyfriend starts dating someone else, because that's just the activity in his brain telling him what to do? How do you feel about that? You know, and actually at that point, when people come up against a kind of an actually real scenario, they sort of default to a different way of seeing things, which is, no, actually there's something there where we have a relationship. Well, what's the relationship? Is the relationship the brain activity, or is it more than that? And where is that rooted? And where does relationality even come from? So I would probably go those two kinds of route with them and try and take them to the consequences of their thinking and show them what it means. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon, for covering so much ground very clearly. I just want to pick you up on something you said earlier on in the talk when you're speaking about the capacities of brains to experience religious feelings and so on.
Yeah.
And you seem to imply, correct me if I'm wrong, that you came down by saying that everyone's brain has an equal capacity for this.
Yes.
And I just want to be devil's advocate there and say perhaps that's not quite true, in the sense that we know that people who are deprived of love in the early years of their life, in the first few years after birth, if they're not given love by a primary carer, are much more likely to become drug addicts, be socially irresponsible and so on. So in some way their brains are damaged by that lack of love early in their life. There are other ways in which people's brains can be damaged.
Yes.
I have some acquaintances who just find the concept of God very difficult to get their heads around.
Yes.
And some, for example, who've had very bad experience of a father,
Yes.
they can't think of God as father.
Yes. Yes.
So is it possible then that some people's brains are different, and some people find it easier to believe in God than others, that people who have been brought up in an atheistic home or conditioned in some way have a greater obstacle? I think Charles Taylor described the difficulty as a failure of the imagination, and people have different levels of imaginative ability. So does that affect the capacity to believe in God?
I think that's a really great question. I think I would want to say that there clearly are differences in kind of people's life experience, but I think that our capacity to think about God and relate to God it's broader than simply what's happened or what's happened in our brains. I definitely agree that people have different kind of backgrounds and propensities to kind of think certain ways, but I think that our attitude towards God is broader than simply our natural genetic predisposition. It's relational, it's social, it's to do with the environment that we've been in, as well as and so there are different. But I also believe that God is not limited by the human brain. He's not limited, and he's much more creative in the way that he can reach people. I think that, and actually some of the most kind of vibrant communities and stories in which God is at work is in those kind of groups of people that you've mentioned as well, that God is not limited in his capacity to reach people. No one is too far in one direction, neurobiologically or psychologically, that he can't reach them. And actually, if I had finished the end of my talk, I would have talked about someone in my church who I heard receive communion, who was like was baptized. They were very severely mentally and physically disabled, but they were clearly reciting these words: I turn to Christ, I repent of my sins, I renounce evil. And also a boy, Luke, who is part of the congregation that I'm part of in Oxford, who's severely mentally and physically disabled, and yet meets with God every week. And so we may not all have the same kind of brain, but God is not limited by the human brain and is able to reach people regardless, sometimes in spite of their kind of neurological makeup. And thank goodness for that, because he has come to save all people. So, thank you for the question.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for working very hard for us this morning. Thank you.
You're welcome.